Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nick Sawicki, and on behalf of the Dorothy Day Guild and America Media, we are pleased to welcome you to this event celebrating the life of Dorothy Day and her legacy, which continues to inspire so many 40 years after her death. America is particularly pleased to partner with the Dorothy Day Guild, as well as the Sheen Center for Thought and Culture and so many other supporters who've made tonight's event possible. Not only because Dorothy Day is such a pillar of American Catholic faith, but because she was a contributor to America for the better part of the last century, always bringing her unique clarity and style that showed a real love and concern for the individuals and topics that she wrote about. Whether it was the daily life of a sharecropper in the 1930s in the American South, whether it was railing against anti-Semitism in Brooklyn, or whether it was sharing a unique and intimate correspondence with an agnostic friend on matters of faith, of despair, and of hope. Dorothy Day, Servant of God, has made innumerable and incalculable contributions to so many throughout the world. Before welcoming Robert Ellsberg, who will convene this evening's conversation, a few housekeeping notes. We are pleased to welcome over 2,000 people from around the world for tonight's conversation, from the United States to the United Kingdom, Ireland to France, Pakistan to Korea, Singapore to Haiti, and in so many other places. We welcome you, and we're glad to have you as part of tonight's conversation. In order to keep the conversation a little orderly this evening, especially as we get to the question and answer period towards the end of the evening, we would ask that at the bottom of your screen that you please use the Q&A button, which will allow you to submit your questions and for us to keep better track of them. Yes, please do not use the chat button at the bottom, but the Q&A button so we can keep better track of your questions. We promise to get to as many as possible, but depending on the number of questions, it's unlikely that we'll be able to answer all of them given how many folks are attending the conversation this evening. Additionally, if you need to drop off at some point, or if you know someone who's unable to make either part or all of this evening's conversation, don't worry. This conversation is being recorded and will be shared to all registrants as well as being made publicly available at a future date. Finally, if you would like to help lead the conversation between the church and the world, I would highly encourage you to visit us at americamagazine.org for the latest news, analysis, and opinion on what matters most. It is now my pleasure to welcome Robert Ellsberg, publisher of Orbis Books, to convene this evening's conversation. Robert?
Thank you. I assume you can hear me all right? Yes? Embarrassing to the 2,000 people listening, if not. I am very happy to welcome you to this celebration of the life and legacy of Dorothy Day. I'm Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books, the editor of several volumes of her writings, and a longtime supporter of her canonization. It's my pleasure to prepare the way for Colleen Dulle, who will moderate the conversation with Paul Elie, Ann Snyder, and David Brooks. And I've been asked to share some opening comments. The basis for this invitation is that although I'm now growing old, I was once very young, and I had the privilege of knowing and working with Dorothy Day in the last year of her life. On the opening credits there, you'll see a young bearded version of myself with Dorothy. I was 19 when I first arrived at the Catholic Worker in 1975, and Dorothy was 77. The thing that was most remarkable to me at the time was how much interest she took in me and other young people, and her ability to recognize and encourage our gifts and possibilities, I should say, that weren't at all evident to ourselves. After I'd only been at the Catholic Worker for a few months, she asked me to serve as managing editor of the newspaper, a task for which I had no evident qualifications. And so in many ways, I could not have foreseen, she set me on the course of my life and vocation, not just as an editor, but as it turns out, as the editor of her writings. Dorothy's granddaughter, Kate Hennessy, has said that to have known Dorothy Day is to spend the rest of your life wondering what hit you. And that was certainly my experience. And 40 years after her death on this date, November 29th, in 1980, I still find myself trying to understand who she was and to share her story with the world. In many ways, I've come to understand her much more deeply than I did when she was alive through editing her writings, and particularly through editing her diaries and selected letters. I learned in particular about the spirituality that was expressed in the ordinary events and encounters of her daily life. Many people associate Dorothy with dramatic actions on the public stage, walking on picket lines, refusing to take shelter during compulsory civil defense drills during the 1950s, which resulted in annual stints in jail, standing beside young men who were burning their draft cards during the Vietnam War, or being arrested for the last time at the age of 75 when she picketed with the United Farm Workers in California. I'm sure we're all familiar with the very famous photograph by Bob Fitch that shows her calmly sitting on a portable stool offset by the outline of two burly and well-armed police officers. It was that image as much as anything that first attracted me to the worker. Of course, we also associate Dorothy with the daily work of the Catholic worker, putting out a newspaper, but also living among the poor, practicing the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, comforting the sorrowful and afflicted. But reading and editing her diary showed me that those activities were only the public face of a life that was mostly spent, as it is for all great souls, and for the rest of us for that matter, in very ordinary and undramatic activities. And it was especially in that realm of ordinary daily life that she expressed her spirituality and found what you might call her path to holiness. In this, she was particularly inspired by her favorite saint, Therese of Lisieux, who taught what she called the little way, the idea that our ordinary duties and encounters expressed in a spirit of love and in the presence of God were actually the principal arena for holiness. That is the way it was for Dorothy. The daily exercise of patience, forgiveness, generosity, unselfishness, the struggle to curb her anger, her tendency to judgment, that was the real crucible of her holiness. On the matter of anger, someone once told Dorothy to hold her temper, and she replied, "I hold more temper in 1 minute than you will in your entire life." In the spiritual discipline of daily life, she found the courage and strength to demonstrate her faith in the public sphere. And of course, she believed in the social implications of Therese's little way, the power of small gestures, the protests we make or fail to make, looking foolish by standing on a street corner with a sign for peace, refusing to take shelter during a civil defense raid. These were the loaves and fishes. We could only offer the little faith and courage and hope that we possess and trust that God would make the increase. That's the way it is with the saints. It's the struggle to be faithful in small things that prepares the way for faithfulness in large matters. Now, through her published diaries, anyone can know Dorothy in this way. But still, there's some things about Dorothy that I think you could only know from spending time with her. For one thing, her intense curiosity and interest in life. Part of this came from the habits of a journalist, accustomed to carrying around a notebook to jot down facts and details about the places she went and the people she met. She never seemed bored or jaded. She was endlessly fascinated by other people, where they came from, what they'd read, what they cared about. What's your favorite novel of Dostoevsky was a common opening question. And I think I told her The Brothers Karamazov, a book I had not actually read, though I was happy to learn that she agreed with me. She had an ear and an eye for beauty, whether in church or from the Saturday afternoon opera on the radio, but she noticed beauty in places that others might overlook, in a piece of driftwood, in the sound of a tanker on the Hudson, an ailanthus tree somehow clinging to life in the midst of a slum, in an image of Guadalupe taped on the wall of a farm worker's shack. She liked to quote St. John of the Cross, "Where there is no love, put love, and you will draw love out." And that was part of her spiritual discipline, to look on all people and all things with the eyes of love, to train her eye to see beauty in the sacred, even when it came to us in disguise. Once when I was fasting in a jail in Colorado, She sent me a postcard with an aerial photo of Cape Cod with the message, "I hope this card refreshes you and does not tantalize you." For Dorothy, all of life was a school of charity and gratitude. As she wrote, "There is desperate suffering with no prospect of relief, but we would be contributing to the misery and desperation of the world if we failed to rejoice in the sun, the moon, and the stars, in the rivers which surround this island on which we live, in the cool breezes of the bay, in what food we have, and in the benefactors God sends us." She had a great spirit of adventure. She was always ready for something new, whether starting a house of hospitality for women or standing up to the IRS when they took her to task for refusing to pay federal income taxes for war. When an exasperated IRS agent once asked her to estimate how much she owed in taxes, she replied, "Why don't you just tell me what you think I owe, and then I just won't pay it." Regardless of how old she became, there was always a youthfulness to her, and she loved the idealism and energy of young people and what she called their instinct for the heroic. She loved conversation around the kitchen table and sharing stories from her long life in the church and the radical movement. The Long Loneliness ends with a meditation where she says, "We were just sitting around talking when everything happened, when Peter Morin came in, when lines of people began to form, when someone said, 'Let's all go and live on a farm.'" She says, "It was as casual as all that, I often think. It just came about. It just happened." That's one of the things you had to experience for yourself being around Dorothy. The unexpected things that could begin in a conversation as you just sat around talking, the way that history or your own life could suddenly take a turn as you were just sitting around the kitchen table over a cup of coffee or a bowl of soup. And she herself was always ready to be inspired and renewed. In her diary, she wrote, "No matter how old I get, no matter how feeble, short of breath, incapable of walking more than a few blocks, with all these symptoms of age and decrepitude, my heart can still leap for joy as I read and suddenly assent to some great truth enunciated by some great mind and heart." And that leads me to one last thing, and this comes as a surprise to many people who only know her through her dour image and photographs. And that's how much fun it was to be with her. She had a tremendous sense of humor and a girlish laugh. Many people have described that. John Court, who joined the Catholic Worker soon after graduating from Harvard in the early 1930s, was drawn to the Worker after witnessing how much fun Dorothy seemed to be having. Here was this woman who appeared to be pretty old at the time, she was in her mid-30s, who seemed to be having the time of her life, and he wanted to have a share of that. When you were with Dorothy, you felt that you wanted to be a better person, and that you could be a better person, and that it would be tremendous fun and a great adventure to be a better person. And I think that's probably how people responded to St. Francis and many other saints. And now Dorothy herself has been proposed as a candidate for canonization. It's become one of the most famous facts about Dorothy that she wasn't fond of being called a saint. In part, that I think reflected the humility that any saint would share. But in large part of it was her desire not to be put on a pedestal, to give the impression that what she did was out of the reach of ordinary people. She didn't even want to look at the canonized saints that way. She talked about them as if they were her friends, her contemporaries. And she felt it was important that we recognize their full humanity, their faults and weaknesses, their doubts and uncertainties. The saints were like us in all ways, and they encouraged us to be more like them. Far from being cynical about saints, Dorothy believed that all Christians were called to be saints. That was not necessarily a matter of being canonized or having a church named after you. It was about striving to conform oneself to the pattern of Jesus, to put off the old person and put on Christ. And that wasn't something that occurred once and for all. It was an ongoing process over the course of a lifetime, responding to the challenges of daily life, the needs of our neighbors, and the demands of our moment in history. That's what she tried to do. And she felt that all of us should aspire to that calling in our own way, in our own circumstances. And yet, the church does recognize certain exceptional figures as official saints, especially people who exemplify and open up a new model of holiness that speaks to the needs of our time. Among other things, Dorothy modeled a new form of holiness by joining the practice of charity with the struggle for justice. Even as a child, when she first learned about the saints, she had recognized this need for a new kind of saintliness when she asked, where were the saints to change the social order? Not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery. It's a question she answered with her own life. Because of Dorothy, we would not have to ask, where were the saints to change the social order? She helped the church rediscover the peace message of Jesus that flows directly from the works of mercy. What you've done to the least of these, you've done to me, whether that is feeding the hungry or burning their farms and villages, sheltering the homeless, or killing those whom we call the enemy. Through her emphasis on the land and farming communities, she pointed to an ecological sensibility, a sense of peace and balance with the earth, which is such a vital aspect of our contemporary Catholic social teaching. She pointed the way to solidarity, the option for the poor, and what Pope Francis envisions, a poor church for the poor. And she did all this as a lay person, as a woman whose conversion was prompted by the experience of pregnancy, who had experienced the joys and anguish of family life and the struggles of maintaining a large and raucous community. I think particularly in our time that Pope Francis has offered a framework for understanding the particular kind of holiness or discipleship that Dorothy represented. In his emphasis on mercy, on hospitality for migrants and refugees, in his call to the church to open its doors and go out to those on the peripheries and the margins, in his call for us to touch the wounds of Christ, in his plea from Nagasaki to abolish the horrors of nuclear weapons, in his wish for a church that is bruised and dirty from being in the streets, rather than safe and clean from living in an enclosed and self-protected bubble. And all these things, I hear the voice of Dorothy Day. Still in the purity of her vision and in her courageous witness, she continues to walk ahead, beckoning the church to follow. So it wasn't surprising that Pope Francis should have referred specifically to Dorothy Day among the 4 great Americans he cited in his speech before Congress in 2015. Such figures, he said, offer us a new way of seeing and interpreting reality. And I think the church can see and appreciate those qualities in Dorothy much more clearly at a distance of 40 years than was possible during her life or at the time of her death. And I think that appreciation is what brings us together this evening on the 40th anniversary of her death. And I think of how much she speaks to us in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has imposed a time of stillness and reflection, and perhaps has made us better able to appreciate how much we are connected to one another and to imagine what it would mean to fashion a world on principles of solidarity, community, and mercy rather than on competition, division, and isolation. In words that speak to this moment, Dorothy concluded her memoir, "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. It all happened while we sat there talking, and it's still going on." And perhaps that conversation will continue this evening. And with that, I'm very happy to enlarge the conversation by turning the program over to Colleen Dulle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. I'm always glad to hear your perspective as someone who knew Dorothy. You know, you give these little insights, these stories about sitting with her, and it brings so much more depth than we're able to just get from her writing or from photos of her, even from those rare video interviews. So thank you. So now I'd like to welcome our panelists. We welcome David Brooks, who is columnist for the New York Times, author of The Road to Character and The Second Mountain. These are 2 books that explore what it means to live a morally engaged life. We also welcome his wife, Ann Snyder, who is editor-in-chief of Comment magazine, which is a journal of public theology for the common good. She's also involved with its partner project, Breaking Ground, which is dedicated to galvanizing the transformative power of the Christian imagination in this year of crisis. And finally, we have Paul Elie, who wrote The Life You Save May Be Your Own, An American Pilgrimage, which is an acclaimed group portrait of Dorothy Day, Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, and Thomas Merton. Paul is a senior fellow with Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, where his work revolves around the expression of religious ideas in literature, the arts, and culture. He's also a regular contributor to The New Yorker. I'm so glad to be joined by all of you. Thanks, welcome. I'm going to start with just kind of an introductory question so that everyone can get to know why we're here tonight, which is, what is your connection to Dorothy? And maybe more revealing, is there anything about Dorothy that you personally find that you relate to? So maybe David, let's start with you.
So I taught a course at Yale, which was called Humility, because I thought it would be funny for a New York Times columnist to teach humility at Yale. I taught 14 books, including St. Augustine's Confessions, Plato, The Symposium, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and one of the books was The Long Loneliness. And I really assigned books that I thought had a shot at changing my students' lives. And there were 14 in the books we taught over the course of the term. And at the end of the term, I gave a final assignment, which was pick any of the 14 books you've read, and apply it to a problem in your own life. And 19 out of the 24 students in the class chose The Long Loneliness.
Wow.
And they were transfixed by her. And some of the best papers were written by Orthodox Jews, by the way. And I was wondering, why were they transfixed by her, as I had been, which is why I assigned it. First, I think they aligned with the fact that she was something of a hot mess as a young woman. She really, I always say, she couldn't just read books, she had to live them out. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. So she lived out a lot of bad stuff. So I think they really appeal to that, and that she had put herself together through surrender. And that was appealing. The second thing was a sense of high calling. I compared her in my book to Dorothea in Middlemarch, someone who from a very early age had a lofty ideals and a spiritual hunger that for a time was not met, but then was met. And I think the students in their idealism related to that. Then a sense of security, which she had achieved. And I think that is something they had not discovered in many of their own lives, a sense of spiritual security, that faith is never still, but faith can provide a grounding and a foundation. And I think they envied the tranquility with which she approached the end of her life. And then finally, a sense of not just social activism and a life dedicated to the poor, but a transcendent frame for that faith. And I think this was true for some of the Jewish students. You know, Moses, when he sought social justice in the first instance with the persecution of the Hebrews, and he killed this Egyptian soldier, he did it outside of any moral system. And it was only in the second story of coming in Exodus that he really was within a framework. And so they found all that within her. And I don't think many came to faith through her, but they found just a magnetic person upon which they could really reflect on their lives. And that would be true for me too.
Thanks, David. And how about you? What was your introduction to Dorothy, and what do you connect to in her?
Yeah, thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I actually encountered Dorothy, I think through David and I worked together on this book that became Road to Character. And somehow she came up as a potential exemplar. So I had at that point in my life never been able to answer the question you often get asked in second grade, fifth grade, eighth grade onward, like who's a hero? And for some reason, I just never been able to answer that in sort of historically integrous way. And suddenly I found someone whose life, while I didn't shadow it or echo it at all, like exactly in my own autobiography, there was something about sort of the personality of Dorothy's prose and her, I think, particular pairing of kind of personalism with sort of a learned realism that just really intrigued me. And at the time, I found myself working in journalism, but I felt like it was a very socially distanced, actually, before that word became a thing, emotionally distant profession in many ways, or at least the models immediately around me had that. And I was struggling with, how do I sort of embody, what is the way of love in this profession? And there was something about her integration of the craft of writing with really, choices of self-sacrifice and choices of accompaniment with those who may have come from a different background from herself, and just deep commitment that sort of painted a pathway for how I could try to at least approximate that in my own kind of journalistic vocation. So I could say more, but I think at the end of the day, and we'll probably come back to this word over and over because it manifests in a million ways in her own life, but her constant striving to integrate what was often within herself a drawing to extremes, extreme passions, extremes in convictions, extremes across left and right sometimes in our current, sort of political categories, and in people. And I think sort of a desire to not sort of succumb to the cheapening of the categories of the world, but actually to seek something deeper that was more centering. So.
You're absolutely right, but I want to come back to all of that. Thank you so much, Anne. And Paul, how about yourself? What was your first exposure to Dorothy, and how do you connect to her?
Thanks for asking, and I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. I'd heard about Dorothy Day in college at Fordham, the way people hear about great Catholics. But my real encounter came through the anthology By Little and By Little, which Robert Ellsberg put together. I bought it in the book sale in the church basement, Corpus Christi Church up near Columbia University. And that book, which is published by Knopf and was given a very literary presentation with gill typeface, no pictures, writing as writing, left a tremendous effect of what Anne's calling the integral quality of Dorothy Day's life, and what in the Catholic and Jesuit presentations we do at Georgetown, we talk about as the whole person. Here was a whole person expressing herself in prose. She's writing about Mexico. She's writing about rallies. She's writing about pregnancy. She's writing a strident piece saying, "Our country passes from undeclared war to declared war. We continue our pacifist stand." She's calling out the true man, Truman, for dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. And on and on and on. This sense of superabundance in that volume. And I was there, and I haven't let go since. I think revisiting her work, as I did just in anticipation of this event, because you asked what strikes us about Dorothy Day today, I was struck in a sense of Dorothy Day as the patron saint of midlife. I'm 55. When she was 55, that's when The Long Loneliness came out, 1952. But it's just amazing to think of all that happened subsequently. That book, a two-part New Yorker profile, the whole air raid conflicts and civil defense actions of the 50s. She goes to Cuba. She goes to Rome and fasts for the passage or adoption of Pacem in Terris and a nonviolent position in the teaching of the church. Second Vatican Council, myriad protests of different forms against the Vietnam War. She's in India with Mother Teresa. She's in Delano with Cesar Chavez. She's in the Lower East Side with the next generation of Catholic workers. She's living the third half of life in her cottage on Staten Island and getting photographed by Avedon. All this happened after she was 55, and that's an incredibly emboldening thing to realize if you're 55 or older.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you're also right about this superabundance of things, lessons that Dorothy offers us, different incidents in her life that we can look into and discuss here. But unfortunately, we only have limited time. So I wanted to zero in, and Robert mentioned earlier, this parallel between Dorothy and Pope Francis. Now, I am a person who runs a Vatican podcast for American media, and so I spend a lot of my time thinking about Pope Francis. I won't ask all of you about him too much, but he has been trying to teach us throughout the course of this pandemic that there's a way for us to take this as an opportunity to stop and to reevaluate what we're about and to undergo a process of discernment, right? He's a Jesuit, he's always talking about discernment, but undergo a process of discernment and really figure out what is it that we see needs to change? How do we want to change? And then let's go do that, right? Let's take this as an opportunity to reset. And Dorothy offers us something similar. There were a lot of similarities, I think, between her time and the time that birthed the Catholic worker movement in particular, and our time now. So Paul, I want to throw this to you. You wrote this great biography of her and these other 20th century Catholics. What parallels do you see between Dorothy's time and our time now?
Thanks for asking. I mean, to think about her life and to think about that period in particular is to realize that the problems of her time were the problems of ours. They're the problems of human society that abide. You've got pandemics, you've got war, there's the struggle of rich and poor, of urban life versus rural life, and all sorts of ways of living in between. You've got the princes of the church forming informal alliances with autocrats, as happened during the Spanish, Franco period, that Dorothy Day was put in a pinch shortly after the Catholic Worker was founded. So those problems just are abiding, and the poor will always be with us in a biblical sense. So we have to find our own era's solutions to those problems, but look to precursors like Dorothy Day. Then more specifically, and this is where Pope Francis comes in, I think, is this matter of Christian personalism. I'm not going to go into personalism in any detail, but Francis is a personalist pope. The human scale is the scale, that's what Christianity tells us. God came to earth and became a human person. The scale of things is the human scale. And he's done a particularly good job of kind of embodying that by just being a human-sized pope. And what Dorothy Day's life tells us again and again is how we live life at human scale. In the pandemic, for example, a lot of us aren't traveling as much. So we have to commit to our families, our neighborhoods, our communities, the people on whom we're most directly dependent, and to be really aware of that. That's something that we may have needed a pandemic to remind us, but she seemed to have grasped early and maintained all along.
Yeah, that's right. I was reading a little bit in preparation for this conversation, and I saw that Anne and David, you guys co-wrote an article talking about how Dorothy, chose to enter into crisis kind of voluntarily, right? Enter into suffering voluntarily. David, you included her in a whole chapter about suffering in your first book. And I wanted to ask you about this because, Dorothy, she did seek out suffering in that way. She also spent a lot of time in self-reflection. And I wonder, in a time that we've all been so, forced to suffer in so many ways, but also been given this opportunity to reflect, what lessons do you think that we can learn from Dorothy about self-reflection and also about choosing to enter into suffering at this time?
Yeah. First, as Paul was speaking, I was thinking about the parallels to our day, and I was thinking about how the radical independence she showed, because she was in the wokesters of her day. She was, people were coming to faith. She was with John Dos Passos. She was Eugene O'Neill, Michael Gold, who was this very prominent Marxist writer in the Village, and she was among them. And then suddenly she came to faith, which would have been the most radically unlike thing you could possibly do in that circle. And a lot of them were like, "Are you crazy? What is, like, you're going to join the reactionaries?"
Right.
And so that was a radical gesture. And it was a time of great inequality. And I run something called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, which we hold up the Dorothy Days of our time. And they are personalists in the way she is. They talk about the whole person. Anne and I have a friend named Pancho Arguelles, who's down in Houston, who takes men, undocumented immigrants who've broken their back and become paralyzed because of construction accidents. And he gives them diapers and catheters and wheelchairs. And he helps work with them to become social workers. So you'll get a dozen Latino guys in wheelchairs coming in your neighborhood to serve. And Pancho speaks in that way of not just a compromised life, but an attempt at a pure life. And I once said to Pancho, you radiate holiness. And he said, "No, I reflect holiness," which is the right answer in that circumstance. I sometimes wonder whether Dorothy suffered too much. It's presumptuous to me to judge. And I think she did have what they called the duty to delight. And as Richard said, she was apparently very fun to be around. But in the diaries, I see such suffering. I see such separation with her daughter. And even in jail, when she's arrested for being a suffragette, such self-recrimination. And to be honest, I think she suffered more than she needed to out of an excessive desire for purity. That's my honest opinion. But you do get the benefits of that suffering. Paul Tillich says suffering interrupts your daily life and reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. And then Tillich writes, it Suffering carves through what you thought was the floor of the basement of your soul, and it carves below that and reveals a cavity below, and it carves below that and reveals a cavity below. So there is a depth to suffering, and people don't come out of that kind of suffering with empty hands. She came out with full hands. And so I do think she exemplifies it, but there are some people who, like, there's a great contrast between Samuel Johnson, the British writer, and Montaigne, who, not quite the same time, but roughly. And Samuel Johnson was like, I'm a sinner, and I'm a sinner. And Montaigne was like, hey, I'm good. I'm fine. I'm a good guy. And my students, when we read them, said Samuel Johnson is an East Coast rapper and Montaigne is a West Coast rapper, if you get that reference. And so, but Dorothy Day was East Coast. She was a sufferer. And I wish somebody had been around to say contentment, because I just feel bad for her, for all that she put herself through, not all that she volunteered for, but all that she put herself through.
Yeah, I think that Robert has also pointed out in some of his writings that Dorothy wrote as an escape, right? So part of it is that she's kind of processing a lot of her negative feelings. And I remember being so surprised when I started hanging out with the Catholic workers in New York and suddenly learning that Dorothy was this fun person with this killer sense of humor, because I had just read her books and been like, oh, she's kind of a miserable person.
Very few people go to their prayer journal and say, hey, I'm awesome today.
Right, exactly, especially not Catholics. And I wanted to ask you about this personalism that David just brought up and that you brought up earlier, and what it's taught you. I mean, we're all people in journalism here, but what it's taught you about your writing, because I know that you said that it's had an impact on you.
I love her personalism. And just actually, Paul triggered something when when you were asking about Pope Francis in the context of personalism. I pulled up one of my favorite quotes of his that I think is very in tune with, in many ways, is sort of a mirror to how Dorothy lived her life, again, both journalistically, but more importantly, sort of her everyday life. And I'm just going to read it here. It's from his very famous interview way back in 2013 in America magazine. It's just this little section where he says, he's being asked a question about contemporary journalism, and he answers, when I insist on the frontier, I am referring in a particular way to the need for those who work in the world of culture to be inserted into the context in which they operate and on which they reflect. There is always the lurking danger of living in a laboratory. I am afraid of laboratories because in the laboratory, you take the problems and then you bring them home to tame them, to paint them out of their context. You cannot bring home the frontier, but you have to live on the border and be audacious. And that sort of quote has always deeply inspired me. And I think, Day herself, her entire life is a model of that, but somewhat in her desire to sort of go to the margins, to always be on the edge of the inside. She just was so committed, I think in part because of her spiritual disciplines, whether it was daily mass, prayer, these journals, as well as just the discipline of living within the annoyances of true community and the inconveniences of it. But through it all, she just really kept the dignity of souls front and center, whole person, as Paul said earlier. And I think especially in our current moment, and I say this as someone who's in a different form of media now, but still in that world where you're writing about others, we are just in this moment culturally in the US in particular, where labels lead and shame sells. And I just find her both very basic in many ways, but also deeply sacred personalism, as radical and morally directive as it ever was. So I think, there's just, and this was perhaps maybe a part of her being female as well, and we may talk about that later, but she always put persons before issues, and was more interested in sort of the complexities of a particular human being, or the texture and smells of chestnuts on the streets, and all of those sort of almost sort of artistic and what's the word I'm looking for? Sensuous. I always get those two confused, but sensuous sort of portrait of reality to complexify the ideological portrait or the statistical portrait. And I continue to think we need a lot more of that certainly in our journalism, but I think more broadly in our public life, where sort of the honoring of persons is primary to any other assumptions you may make or judgment calls, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, to maybe use another word from the Christian tradition, everything about her life and her writing is incarnational, right? She believes in, she believes in a God who became a person, and that's clear in her life too. She's not willing to just have ideas be, what she has motivate her. What she has motivating her is going out in the street, is being with people, is the sense of community. You've gotten at, Anne, this idea of Dorothy's integrated life, how she kind of, much like Pope Francis, Paul was saying, she transcends a lot of the binaries, a lot of the tensions that I think our polarized society pushes us towards. This is a question for kind of everyone on the panel, so whoever wants to take it can. I wonder about, how we can express the manner in which Dorothy was able to integrate opposing viewpoints. Because I think there's a few different models for us here. You can either say, oh, I'm holding them in tension, or you can say Dorothy was focused on something else. She was focused on the person, on the poor, and so this helped her transcend these binaries. Or some people offer a model of trying to make a synthesis by taking the best of each. I wonder how all of you might express the way that Dorothy was able to do that, and what kind of model that offers us for today when we're also faced with, a society that pushes us towards these oppositions. It's a big question, I know.
I'll first. I feel like I should throw to Paul, but I'll go first. The one thing, in the 60s, in some sense, she was very much on the left, the anti-war movement, etc. But culturally, she was not a hippie. And she did not like the idea of using the Dixie cup for the Eucharist, and she was not an antinomian. She believed in sin, and so in that way she cut across. I think one of the interesting ways she cuts across, and has even been evident in our conversation here, is between the sense of personal service and systemic change, mm-hmm. and that her ability to be on both sides of that equation is a rare ability. And she clearly was in personal service, but also she was there to the suffragette, to the peace movement, to the pacifism, to real big systemic change. And one of the things that's struck me about her, in my book, I sort of mentally paired her with Frances Perkins, who was the first labor secretary under FDR, and also spent a life of service, but in politics. And that's what we usually think of as systemic change. And in a life of politics, compromise is everything. And getting your hands dirty is everything. And working with bad actors and taking the responsibility of the situation on yourself and dirtying yourself while doing half measures. And Day was not like that. So these are two different versions. One is holding up the lofty ideal and marching for a just cause, and the other is getting your hands dirty. I think both these roles are necessary in systemic change. And she was just a rare person who did both personal service and that kind of structural change that a lot of people are trying to do today.
Mm-hmm. She kind of raises a question for me of if you can do one without the other credibly.
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Not a question to be answered. Paul, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that last one though?
Well, thinking about binaries, I'm not quite sure what ones you mean, but let's not fret about that. What's striking about Dorothy Day's life is how it reminds us that binaries existed, in prior ages too, and that she actively had to push past them. The story of her life in the late teens and early 20s was she was living in the village, and there was what Malcolm Cowley called the war in Bohemia, between the Bohemians and the radicals. And the radicals wanted to change society along communist lines, and the Bohemians wanted to kind of live free and challenge social norms without a thoroughgoing revision of society. And these two positions were in uneasy coexistence, and Dorothy Day felt some attraction to both of them. But what she noticed about the radical position is that the radicals who were intellectually in solidarity with the poor weren't actually socially in solidarity with the poor. the poor were to be found in the Catholic Church. So she wanted to be joined actually to the poor. And so kind of stepping out of one set of binaries and ignoring what David alluded to earlier, the fact that the Catholic Church in doctrine and in theory was aligned with the powers and principalities, she went there because that's where the poor were to be found. At some point, there's no accounting for it other than human stubbornness and determination. And that brings us back to personalism. No trend created Dorothy Day. She didn't wait for circumstances to be propitious for a social movement of the kind that she had a priori envisioned. She kind of went and got it done and pushed through. And that's a really powerful model for us. We can't wait for the right circumstances. We've got one life, the clock is ticking, and we've got to get busy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the things that always strikes me when I'm at the Catholic Worker is, it's however much you want to read these big ideas of Dorothy's and everything and of Peter Morin's, right? When you get there, you're put to work. And it's, when you ask people at the Worker what they do, they say, I do whatever needs to be done. And that's something that I think it's a really powerful lesson for us today who, at least I myself tend to get lost in these idea debates. And it's like, well, actually, just go out and do the work. I want to ask you all about loneliness, which Dorothy wrote a lot about in her book called The Long Loneliness, obviously. And she writes at the end of The Long Loneliness that, quote, we have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. And yet right now we're in a time of isolation. Community can seem like it's in short supply, or it's only mediated by Zoom, which has, it opens us up so that we can have conversations with 2,000 people, but also it limits us in that it's not sitting around the table at the Catholic Worker. And so I wonder, how do we build community? How do we build a sense of solidarity in this time of isolation? What does Dorothy have to teach us about that?
She was an interesting mixture of the aloof personality type of a writer with the tremendous hunger for community. Mm-hmm. And she lived with people all around her all the time, but you had the sense that was not her default. I often tell young journalism students, if you are at a football game and everybody's doing the wave and you just sit there and don't do the wave, then you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist, because we don't actually do anything. We just sit back and watch other people do things. And she did have a little of that personality, but knew that was not the life she was called and not the life that God asked her to do. And so she had the advantage and the challenge of being with people. Now, in our circumstance, it's hard. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic on social trust that I worked on for several months. In the beginning, it was going to be the year that made America, because I thought this was a time of coming together and supporting each other. And especially in March and April, there was a sense that neighbors were getting to know each other, families were getting to know each other. There was a sense of cultural communion. We were all going through an experience together. I have to say, there's no evidence to support the idea this has been good for at least American society. There's plenty of evidence to suggest this has been very terrible for American society, because we did not at the end of the day come together, partly because of our political divisions, but also because of our social divisions and because of a pervasive whale of distrust. We are a more fractured society than we've ever been. And that's partly, I think, because of the emotional trauma of being alone, and partly for a lot of underlying structural reasons. And so I do think, rather than look at this as a time when Dorothy Day-style community was built, it was a time when Dorothy Day-style was estranged. And we just have to go into 2021 with that realism and take her radical commitments as a model. The commitments to the houses, to the centers, to the worker, but also her personal commitments. One of the most amazing things about her is at the end of her life, when her great love interest, Forster, has this woman he's living with, Annette, who's dying of cancer. And he sort of gets out of Dodge and asks her to take care of her. And even that radical act of compassion, which she does, and nurses Nanette to her death, that's the small act that leads to the rebuilding of community. Emerson said, souls were not saved in bundles, they're saved one by one. And it's that sort of act that we're called on to do whenever this is over. Because we not only have to heal the division that we walked into COVID with, but the open wounds that have been exposed by it.
Thanks, David.
I'm always the life of the party.
Anne or Paul, did you want to add anything on that point?
I guess, I would say in person, obviously, I think we would all agree, everyone here, that it's just been a very challenging year to be creative in terms of how to, how to be hospitable in a way that isn't putting others at risk, and how to celebrate a public sacrament, be that a wedding or a funeral, and, just like all the sort of standard modes of love and conviviality and memory and all of those kind of sacred monuments, all of that has been made much more difficult, although people have creatively found ways virtually. I'm lucky in that I steward a magazine, and so I've just tried my best this year to think about ways in which, what is the pain that needs to be brought to speech? And we've not just the pandemic this year, but in the US again, there's been this huge, more widespread racial reckoning. I think deeper questions around character of leadership and the sense, sort of meaning of life type questions going around. And I was talking to a friend on Thanksgiving Day saying, I bet this year in a maybe counterintuitive way, people's Thanksgiving tables as they go around and say what they're grateful for are probably more pronounced and poignant and in some ways heartfelt than previous years, just because we've all been sort of thrust back to the rudimentary, to really appreciate the rudimentary things of life, like trust, like hugs, like all sorts of things that I think we see that have been revealed this year for being as vital as they are to pure societal survival. So I think my question, just editorially, and this trying to answer your question, sort of how do you try to build a sense of community, is to point people towards more inviting questions about their own lives and the society in which they live, and to also be giving plenty of voice for the very real grief out there that often is vague but just needs some time to kind of crystallize. And somehow in that, to borrow Dorothy's phrase, I think she always talked about writing being an act of community, to try to allow people to feel accompanied wherever they are, whether it's through words, images, and so that's just one way. And I think each of us, probably in different vocations, whether they be very physical or more cerebral, have a way to answer that question. What is the way of love in this task?
Not the best known episode from Dorothy Day's life, but she was a frontline worker in a pandemic.
That's
she
right.
worked at Kings County Hospital during the influenza pandemic, emptying bedpans, changing sheets, caring for patients, accompanying the dead bodies out to the makeshift morgues of that time. And there's no question that it had a deep effect on her. She described the sacrament of discipline that it initiated into her, the combination of a strict schedule and service that was at once a gift and a requirement, let's say. I think we as a society are looking for a lot of cheap grace from this pandemic. We're thinking the pandemic will change us. That's not how things work. People are changed by events, but it happens individually and it happens over decades. Let's hope that there's a Dorothy Day or two out there who the experience of frontline work is an initiation into the sacrament of discipline on the level of depth that it was for her. But we can't really expect that we're going to just be changed by this experience, whether me or Pope Francis. It's just too easy a move, I think. And I don't think Dorothy would expect that.
I want to invite our viewers at home to submit questions using the Q&A button. We'll be moving to that in just a minute. I do want to kind of do a little practice here of something that Dorothy often had to remind herself to do, which is the duty of delight as our last question before we move into our audience questions. So I wanted to just go around and ask, Dorothy often sought beauty, especially in situations of ugliness, situations of pain, of suffering, which is certainly the situation that many of us find ourselves in this year. So as a last question for each of you, where are you seeing beauty these days? What are you delighting in these days?
I just find myself a lot, I think I'm hopefully speaking for everyone watching here and on this panel, but I just find myself so much more attentive to details that I wasn't previous, often details in nature, sometimes idiosyncrasies in my husband, the arc of a Frisbee, just like, I think, moments of grace sort of in physical things. I'm cutting a lot more flowers than normal and rearranging them over and over. But I think just sort of the aesthetic of the natural world, including other human beings. And I just finding my sort of observational sense just much more ponderous. And there has been a lot of gratitude in that, at just seeing life.
I think the social commitments that we're seeing in this moment are beautiful. Basically, this summer, when the commercial power, I mean, so much of our public space is devoted to commerce, and when a lot of that was withdrawn because of the pandemic, into that public space surged people calling out for justice against police brutality, the use of force, state-sponsored violence. This is a beautiful thing to see our streets alive with people claiming individual agency to speak out against social injustice. And then to see 80 million people voting for one candidate, and 74 million people voting for the other candidate, to see people stepping up to vote for the first time, it's a beautiful thing. And on those two levels, this kind of social engagement is something to behold.
And I would say one of the most spiritually beautiful moments I've ever read is a Dorothy Day story. Probably everybody on this call knows, but I love telling it, and I probably read it in Paul's book. But it was the time at the end of her life when she was asked if she would write a memoir by Robert Coles. And she said she sat down and she wrote A Life Remembered. And then she said, I thought of the Lord and his visit to us all those many centuries ago, and I was just grateful to have had him on my mind all that time. And that moment of rest and tranquility is just a spiritually beautiful moment. And so I think she's inspired many people with episodes like that. I would say in my life previously, traveling around with this Weave project, there are a lot of Dorothy Days out there. They're not quite like her, but they're a bit like her. You go into any community and you land and say, who's trusted here? And you find people who are living lives for others. And Ann and I have a friend named Jimmy Dulle who lives in Waco, Texas, who's a pastor, and he lives literally with a homeless shelter and is attached to his house. And he wanted to serve the homeless at church. The homeless didn't come to church, so he took the church to the homeless, and he has a church called Church Under the Bridge in Waco, Texas, where he under a highway overpass, he was running a church. And so you meet these people and they're out there. And so that element of just human service and living as Jesus wanted us to live is prevalent and untalked about. And as somebody who works for the New York Times, it is a shame on us that we don't cover these people enough, because we have a broken model of social change, which is that it's our job to expose the problems of the world. It's not our job to expose the solutions of the world. And so we have this focus on the negative. But those people are out there, and I'm sure everyone on this call has those people in their lives. And the final thing I'll say just about this year is I think all of us have rediscovered natural beauty. I was on a panel last summer with a woman named Kate Bowler who has stage 4 cancer and is living with it. And there was a guy in the audience who has stage 4 cancer and is more in peril right now. And he just rose to the audience and said, I'm like you, I've got stage 4 cancer. And she said, what's it like? He said, I just find I like to be outside more. And through COVID, I think we've all spent more outside. And even yesterday, I was taking a walk and the sun was setting, the rays were coming through the tree trunks. And I'm of course walking with my phone And I look up from Twitter and I see this awesome natural beauty. I think we've all had moments like that, and that we couldn't appreciate before because we weren't stuck in one place.
Yeah. You mentioned that there are so many Dorothys out there. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge our gratitude for all the Catholic workers who are on this call today, who are actually putting this work into action, and living out Dorothy's legacy in a way that the rest of us can only hope to do a fraction of. So very, very grateful for them. So let's pivot to taking some questions from the audience. One of the first things, maybe Paul, you might be the person to answer this, since I think you've read the most of her writings out of everyone on this panel. Someone asked, I think fear is one of the things that is preventing formation of real communities today. What can you tell us about Dorothy's approach to the idea of fear? Does anything come to mind?
You know, I'm tempted just to say she was fearless. I don't think that's the case. But what's easy to lose sight of, because canonization is in process, is just how unpopular some of the positions she took. To begin at the end, you know, there are a number of people from the Catholic worker community now who are about to enter prison for an act of protest against nuclear weapons in Georgia, the Kings Bay Plowshare 7. And their story is not prominent. Their suffering is going to go largely unrecorded in the media, but it's directly in line with the principles of Catholic worker and the life of Dorothy Day. And to think of them is to be reminded of just how marginal and how unpopular Dorothy Day was in her time. If she was looking for something that would scale or something that would poll well, none of this ever would have happened. So I don't know how she dealt with fear or what she wrote about fear in her diaries, but at some level, she was bold enough to step beyond the natural human fears and say, this is what I'm called to do. This is what the gospel says to do. This is what we ought to do. And now let's go and do it.
And you mentioned maybe wanting to talk about Dorothy and her perspective on womanhood. There's a question here that's coming from someone anonymous, so I can't get their name. But they said, it was mentioned that Dorothy's pregnancy played a major role in her conversion. Would someone please talk more about that and how she viewed her abortion? I wonder if you could talk about maybe what she said about pregnancy, and also what she said about, or how she's affected you and your perception of womanhood.
Yeah, well, David, I think is probably better on the pregnancy and abortion piece, so I'll let him handle that. Although she did famously, I think she when she gave birth to her daughter, she somehow she must have decided this before childbirth occurred, but she noticed that all the accounts of childbirth were written by men, and she thought she might be good to change that. So I think, David, am I right? Like 45 minutes after the umbilical cord was cut, she just sat down and wrote the entire sort of experience, physically, the sort of the earthquake and the fire and all the sensations, as well as the extraordinary joy of seeing her daughter for the first time. So I always love that little story, and love that she kind of pioneered an essay on the subject as a woman experiencing it. I think she's interesting to me because she was so formidable in many ways. Like, I see her as a woman, at least publicly, of such spine, which isn't to say that you can't be that way as a woman, but I think I also see there's something like very distinctively feminine in the gifts she brought to bear in her writing and work. There was, she's almost like a Edith Stein kind of feminine genius. She led with sort of and wrote with this concreteness and an incarnationalism, as has been already named, and this personalism that just tends to be more female territory than male instinct. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but I think in many ways she was, both in her voluntary poverty and building of these houses of hospitality, a womb for other souls. Or if she herself wasn't, because she did have this writerly desire, I think, sometimes to self-isolate and get away from everybody, she at least created space for these kind of nurturing, formative wombs for souls, both poor and well-equipped to be together. And in many ways, the fact that she saw writing as an active community was sort of the most feminine definition, bringing a relational instinct to and from the ink on the page. So yeah, that's how, David, you might have more insight into the actual sort of pregnancy and her, and that being in literally and figuratively sort of an incubator for her final leap of faith.
I hesitate with Paul on the call, but I'll do my story. Paul can correct me. My memory is that she did want to write an account of giving birth, and I think she wrote it for the New Masses, if I'm not correctly, which was a left-wing magazine at the time. And she wrote about the pain, the fire of pregnancy, the fire of delivery. And then I'm going to botch the quote, but the climax comes, and she said, if I had painted the greatest painting, sculptured the greatest sculpture, or written the greatest symphony, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. With that came a vast floods of love and joy and a need to thank someone, a need to express gratitude. And of course, the person she expressed gratitude to was Jesus and to God. And that was her coming of faith. I hope I haven't mangled that story, Paul. I'm doing it from memory, but it was a moment of faith through gratitude. Now you can tell me I've got it all wrong.
I think you got it right. I guess what I remember exploring in my own book was how that the gratitude that then applied in so many areas was especially concentrated at that moment because she thought she might not be able to get pregnant. It was an unexpected situation for her, and the gratitude she felt was itself unexpected. She had a gratitude so large that she could not account for it without expressing it in terms of God, and so that so much that flowed from that deep sense of gratitude for life, for motherhood, being tied up with creation and the Creator, and she kind of went and acted on that, for the next 43 years or whatever it was.
I want to ask y'all about, we have a question from Mark Murray, who says, Therese of Lisieux was famously one of Dorothy's spiritual anchors. Who were her other spiritual anchors? I think Teresa of Avila was, no? She named her daughter Tamar Teresa and said that she had pulled that name from both, I believe. Paul, you might correct me on that one too.
Both Teresas meant a lot to her. A whole bunch of other saints, and one of the most powerful aspects of the Catholic worker then and now is the way the lives of the saints are represented visually in the newspaper. It's kind of like saying the lives of the saints are news, and Dorothy Day, both in her writing and in her life, made it feel that way. She cycled through different saints at different points. Just because I'm a writer, I think so much about how much different writers meant to her. Again and again in the course of her life, she would either pull herself out of depression or gird herself for a big challenge by reading a great novel. Dostoevsky, Dickens, Tolstoy, lesser known works like Bread and Wine by Salome. So those politically engaged, spiritually alive writers were also really significant figures for her, and they just show up all through her work if you're paying attention.
This might be a bigger discussion, so maybe I'll throw in some follow-up questions here, but someone simply asked, what is the role of personalism in addressing social justice? And I think what they're probably getting at is, this personal relationships with people that Dorothy was very focused on. How does that relate to the process of big social change, of also being the saints who want to change the social order, as Robert said earlier? I wonder if any of you wanted to offer any insights on that.
Somebody once said that personalism is an alternative. It's the transcendent middle ground between individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other. And personalism is between and rises above those two. And it's of course built on the dignity of the human person, the whole person. And so if you conduct a policy as if each human being has an infinite and equal soul, and that becomes the foundation of your policy making, then your attitudes towards poverty are certain things, your attitudes toward even realism in foreign policy are certain things. And so it really is, to me, it's a separation of a lot of our usual categories of thought and an orientation around the dignity of the human being. And John JP2 was, of course, another leading personalist philosopher. And a lot of that grows out of his reaction to communism.
Right. It also reminds me of, in his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis talks about how every social transformation begins with meeting a person and having a sit-down discussion with them, having a personal relationship with someone who's different from you. And he says, it's in getting to know someone that you then get to know the social issues that affect them. And it's by, starting to love them in that context that then leads you to want to work to transform the social structures that might be unjust to them or whatever. We are just about out of time and are going to transition back to Robert, but I wanted to ask if anyone had anything that they wanted to add before we do that.
Just following what you said, Colleen and David, for Dorothy Day, the personal scale, it didn't take much explaining. She wrote an essay about kissing a leper twice. That's what personalism was. The leper in front of you was the leper in the Gospels. The poor person in front of you was Jesus. And you would resist every attempt to kind of scale it up. You just keep things on that scale. And she was opposed to large parts of the New Deal because they didn't involve the works of mercy performed at a personal sacrifice. So I think she's a great reminder that we shouldn't look to scale out our social justice efforts. Personalism is the way as far as she's concerned, one-on-one, and keep doing it that way. That's
right. She's, I'm sorry, I've got something in my throat. But yeah, you're right. She's opposed to all forms of bigness, right? That's, big business on one hand, big government on the other. She's content to, work with the people who show up at the door and give the person in front of them what they need. And that's entirely her model. Robert, can I bring you back to maybe fill in any gaps that we've left as somebody who knew Dorothy personally, and maybe close out our evening?
Yes, happy to fill the gaps. I really enjoyed this conversation. There were so many places where I would have liked to jump in, but I think everybody handled the questions very well. I think that the question that was raised on how does Dorothy, would she relate to our time today, which is so interesting. And among other things, one of the latest things that I've just edited is her columns from the 1960s, which will appear in the spring. The title On Pilgrimage, the 60s. There was an early edition of that, but I redid the whole thing and re-edited it. And what struck me very much, referring to a lot of the events that Paul referenced, that happened in the latter part of her life, what an exciting time that was. And in some ways in the 60s, you see Dorothy kind of the world catching up with her in a way. And as David pointed out, I think responding to her radicalism and her protest, there were not that many models of people of her generation or Catholics or Christian leaders who were on the front lines there being arrested and standing in solidarity with draft resistors, that sort of thing, marching with the civil rights movement or the farm workers. But David was also right that she was not a 60s person. She was not one of those radicals later who was nostalgic for the wonderful 60s and the spirit of just rebellion and counterculture. And in fact, she was quite resistant to aspects of that culture, which meant that that in the 60s, just like every other time, she didn't quite fit into the usual binary categories, as has been pointed out. And you see in the 60s her responding so much to the events of her time, including going to Cuba in 1962, just before the missile crisis, going to Rome during the Second Vatican Council, going south to cover and write about the civil rights movement. But Dorothy was never somebody who just was in favor of protesting for the sake of protesting or just announcing all the things you're against. And I think that's an aspect of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker that people don't focus on enough, because we know about her work with the works of mercy, which she shares with many other religious congregations, Mother Teresa, everybody, Franciscans. And we know that one of the unique things that she did was to join that with resistance and protest against a system that gave rise to so much poverty and injustice. So the protest, what she was against, and what she did with the works of mercy, we focus on those things. But there's the third element, maybe it's the part that kind of Peter Morin brought into the Catholic worker, I think, which is this question of what are you for? What is the alternative society that you are trying to work toward? And her personalist approach to that was not to just create a new bureaucracy or structure or institution or organization to embody that, but that we should begin where we are now, to live by the values that we would like to see in place, whether that's, involves nonviolence, community, generosity, solidarity. So I think those three things are kind of the ingredients of the Catholic worker soup, if you want to call it that. One thing I wanted to respond to was David's reference to her maybe inordinate suffering that she, and of course, people pointed out that she also had a capacity for joy and humor and that sort of thing. But I think of Dorothy really as the complete kind of woman of the Beatitudes. Pope Francis has said that's a Christian's identity card, job description, you want to call it that. And you could look through each of those Beatitudes, which is the program that Jesus laid out, or the description of the qualities or virtues of discipleship. And each one of them, she didn't just live that, but she kind of enlarged our understanding of what that might mean. If you look at, blessed are the poor in spirit, for instance, and how that relates to our time, to model a non-acquisitive, value of letting go of the kind of grasping, ego that drives so much of our economy and so much of our culture. Or if you look at blessed are those who mourn. Now, that doesn't just mean that you're sad all the time. Here's somebody who has the gift of tears or something. But I think it's very much in terms of what Pope Francis has talked about, in a person whose heart is open and vulnerable to the pain of the world, and does not have, is not driven by that kind of self-protective impulse to shut out or desensitize ourselves to things that are just too hard to think about. And Dorothy never insulated herself from the suffering of the world around her. But it was, in that spirit of where there's no love, put love, you'll draw love out. That the response to that was not just to be depressed, but to invite the world into your heart and share with the world, the love that is there. And of course, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who hunger for God's righteousness. Blessed are the meek. I think of Dorothy also, I'm always referring to Pope Francis, but in her criticism, and people have mentioned this, of big institutions, big movements, trying to make a big impact. This is one of the places where she differed, I think, from the spirit of the 60s, where she felt that spirit of protest and of just focusing entirely on what you were against would create a sense of frustration and desperation and a kind of escalation in tactics, as people felt that, okay, it has to be a bigger rally. It has to involve, getting in a fight with the police or hard hats or something. It had to involve offending people with four-letter words, drawing attention to yourself, publicity, bigness. Whereas Dorothy, everything about her was about the power of small means, individual means, personal conscience, standing on a street corner by yourself, sitting in the City Hall Park during the civil defense drills. I think, again, like Pope Francis, whose two of his great mottos are reality is more powerful than ideas. And for Dorothy, that meant that she really wasn't all that interested in ideologies or abstract kind of concepts. She was much more interested in how ideas were lived out by people. I've told this story many times, but the first time I met Dorothy and I tried to make an impression on her, I said, I was 19, forgive me. How do you reconcile anarchism and Catholicism? And she just looked at me and said, it's never been a problem for me. And I think if I'd asked her to talk about the anarchism of Sacco and Vanzetti or Tolstoy or something like that, she would have had a lot to say about that. But she wasn't this kind of ideological thinker. The other line of Pope Francis that resonates so much is that time is more powerful than space. And many in the radical movement or in other movements, whatever, are focused on seizing power, of having the high ground, of commanding, the forces. Whereas Pope Francis and Dorothy, had this idea that planting seeds, setting processes in motion that will perhaps flower or bear fruit in ways that we can't imagine, will ultimately carry the day. So in a lot of ways, a person out of step with many of the values of her time and of our time. But precisely for that reason, I think somebody who still remains so radical and hard to box into our categories, whether political or religious.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you to all our panelists. Robert, I know that you had just one closing message about the Dorothy Day Guild. I see some people asking about it in the comments. So maybe you can wrap us up and then we'll get out of here.
I do want to acknowledge the comments that have come in from many people who've said they wish that actual members of the Catholic worker community were part of this conversation. And I would be very remiss if I did not encourage people who are interested in supporting Dorothy's work and mission to reach out to the Catholic worker, whether in New York or in your local community. And you can find out more about the Catholic worker and how to make those kind of contacts through the Dorothy Day Guild. And for those who are interested in promoting the legacy of Dorothy Day and who feel in particular that it's a good thing to see her canonized, I urge you please to join and support the Guild in any way. You can find it online at just one word, DorothyDayGuild.org. The Guild has been working to support the work of the Archdiocese of New York to prepare her cause for canonization. And I can report that work is nearly complete. We actually expect that by June of next year, everything necessary will be assembled and ready to send to Rome for the next phase of the process. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, it's a very complicated, long, and expensive process, and your support is gratefully received. And on the subject of gratitude, I do want to thank all our generous panelists, David, Anne, and Paul, and especially Colleen and Nick, and our partners from America Media who made this evening possible, and all of you who have joined us from around the world for this evening. So good night and stay well.